Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul. Some of you may not know this, but I actually used to be much more creative than I am now. I wrote quite a lot of poems. I wrote a few songs, some of which you can listen to on YouTube. And most importantly, I was a novelist. Now, I am a published author. I don't think I'm quite ready to reveal what book I wrote because I don't know if I want every single person on the internet to know my name. But I am pleased to tell you guys all about the novels that I wrote, why it is that I decided not to publish them, and just share with you some pictures. I've got some drawings that some of my friends contributed of some of the characters. I've got a drawing of the map of my world. I really want to just explore or have you guys explore the inner workings of my mind when I actually do decide to be creative instead of always doing the same thing over and over again. So let me first make a disclaimer. When I get into why the books weren't published, the main reason, besides just not wanting to go through all that trouble, is I was afraid of two things. One was audience interpretation. I was really worried that someone would take my hard work and use it for nefarious purposes or try to, I don't know, create fantasies based on my characters that I had tried so hard to make pure. And the second reason, and this may come across as slightly anti-LGBT, but it's actually out of respect for them. But just hear me out before you jump to conclusions. The second reason is that when I started writing my first novel trilogy, this was back in 2008, and then I finished them around 2012, so it took me quite a while. And at that time, the LGBT as we know it didn't really exist, or if it did, it wasn't nearly talked about as much. The terms transgender and non-binary didn't mean squat. No one knew what that meant. If you had said back then, hey, I'm non-binary, we would have said, so you mean you're not part of the number system of zeros and ones? Like, that is what we thought of. And so when I proposed certain ideas in my novels, they probably would have seemed like leftist LGBT propaganda when that wasn't my intention. I was just trying to be creative and offer a unique commentary on the nature of romance and the idea that a genderless being could exist. But then after the movement of I am what I feel and the idea that what and who you were born as doesn't equal who you think you are, it made it so that I didn't want people to use my novels as a way of bolstering that agenda or as a way of saying that I was against that agenda. So I figured, you know what? I tried to be creative, but apparently there are actual people that think like this, and that's just frustrating. So that's why I'm confident enough with sharing to you guys everything about those, well, maybe not literally everything because that would take too long, but most of the big reveals and secrets and concept art and all that that went into the creative process. So my first three novels were called the Dawn Trilogy. The first book was called Dawn of the Dark Resurrection. The second book was called Dawn of Time. And the third book was called Dawn of the Forsaken Souls. I remember for so long I was teasing people about what they thought that the third title would be, and the only hint I gave them was it's Dawn of the fill in the blank, and so that kept people guessing for quite a while. And I also originally intended the books to be just one giant book, but then my friends suggested that I turn it into a trilogy so that I could flesh out the various concepts, and that really worked for me because I thought of a new twist on sequel continuation. As stories being told out of order, that's been done before. Star Wars is one of the prime examples. But I wanted to present a scenario where if I told my stories out of order, it's because the plot demanded it. So Dawn of the Dark Resurrection is chronologically the second book, but it's the first one that I recommend people read because the main reason why the main characters why the second book is the prequel is because the main characters at one point are in such despair that they look through like an old journal of like the ancient times and try to see if maybe that can give them a clue as to how to proceed forward. So like the second book in universe is meant to be them reading through the history of the series. And then as far as the third book, I just wanted that to be like, the actual finale after you've learned all of the secrets of the lore. And also, I think on a pure shock value, another reason why I wanted the first or the second book to be the first book chronologically is that I didn't think it would work very well in the twists. Like one of the biggest twists in the first book was that Daniel, the main character, had a best friend named Chris. And they were like basically the bro buddy stereotype of that time, where every teenage guy had like one guy where he would always fist pump and chest bump and all that fun stuff. And it turned out that Chris was actually one of the wizards this whole time. Not only was he a wizard, but he also created the girl that he claimed was his sister all along, and he was also responsible in creating the world. Now, in the prequel, The Dawn of Time, that was revealed like pretty much right away as part of the book that he existed among this crowd of wizards, and so it's like the origin story of how he came to be Daniel's friend and how he came to deceive him so much. So if the audience had known that right off the bat, then the big reveal when Chris is like, "Yeah, I'm a wizard and I also helped create the world," like that wouldn't have had the same impact. As far as other cool twists in the book, well, I guess I should tell you what the main premise was. So the first book, Dawn of the Dark Resurrection, basically it starts out with Daniel and his siblings and Chris and Selena, who are supposedly siblings, but they're actually creator and daughter. I'll get into why I don't say father later. And they're just, casually hanging out. And then one day they rent this mysterious book from the library. And that book turns out to be like a lost memory of one of the other creators of the world. Of course, they don't know that yet. And he says that the third creator of the world, again, the whole like the three sages created the world wasn't revealed right away, that the third one, Malsafar, the villain, was attempting to. Again, I've had so many revisions of this book that sometimes it's hard to keep track of all the different things I changed. But basically, he was planning on creating an army to establish proper dominion over the world, feeling like he deserves it as he was also partially the creator. But again, the wizard Ceylon worded it in such a way that he didn't give it away. Like he was the epitome of a person who did not know how to speak very clearly. So he always worded things in half-truths and secrets. And oh boy, did Daniel have a few choice words against him in the third book. And so he essentially urged them, like, hey, your parents made a covenant to protect this town for so many years, and eventually Malsafar is going to destroy it. So even if you don't believe me on this whole conquest thing and you want to just be pacifist in this war, I think you should help me discover the secret to beating him, because he created something called a memory key, which like locked away the part of history that contained his weakness. So even if they hypothetically had the thing that could damage him, it wouldn't do anything because they don't know that it's a weakness. So essentially they had to gain the knowledge of why the thing that they had was effective against him. So I should probably mention who Daniel's siblings and Selena are. Selena was basically at the time my way of coping with all the problems that I had with females. So it was like an escape of like, okay, if females can't treat me well in real life, maybe I can create like this novel equivalent. So Selena is, well, I'll show you some pictures of her later, and I also have a Selena lookalike that I'm going to show you, but she was 6 feet tall, not like ridiculously slender, but not also not obese. She was kind of like just relatively well built. She had really long black hair, and the black hair is significant, which I'll tell you guys about later. Uh, and she also was just this very nonconformist type of girl. She didn't like being like the other girls and was often like made fun of because she always wore pants. She always wore black despite not being goth. And she also didn't like to shave her legs. She was all about like, oh, that's just a societal thing. Why should I bother? And she was like Daniel's other best friend. And I wanted to present a story where like usually the guy and the girl develop a friendship over time, but I wanted it so that they already had an established friendship and like going on this journey together helped them to kindle their friendship even more. And then his siblings, Daniel has three siblings, although in the third book it's revealed that he actually had a fourth sibling that was killed by his father. But the three siblings that survived were Claire, who's 4'11" at the age of 11, and I eventually revealed in the third book that she didn't grow to be too much taller. She had blonde hair that was a little bit longer than mine. She has a very severe pantophobia, which means fear of everything. So very much the type of person that got easily startled, but also had like determination to change the world someday. And she like wanted to find a cure for cancer. So I think that was like my way of conveying to the audience that she wasn't going to be paralyzed by her fear, that she wanted to eventually overcome it. She also had a complex about being short, how like all the girls on her soccer team were taller than her and how she could barely kick the soccer ball. And of course, Selena, always the voice of motivation, is like telling her like, hey, being short isn't what matters. What matters is the strength of the heart. And then Daniel had two twin brothers named David and Joseph. Those of you that know me really well are probably chuckling right now at those name choices. They were twins who were both 9, and even though they were technically shorter than Claire, they eventually overshot her, and they were basically like these stereotypical jock 9-year-olds, the ones that like weren't particularly sensitive to others' feelings. They kind of loved fake sword fighting and talking cool, and they usually like didn't have a whole lot of touchy-feely moments. So you could say that they were kind of like a bit gruff for their age. And so they're basically the book is all about like them as friends getting along, having conversations, and talking as the story progressed. Because I was really fond of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, which came out a year before I started writing this. And so I wanted to like rekindle the magic of exploring this unknown world. But in their case, they had never been outside their town. So they're like going into like the world of the wizards. And again, I have a map that I'm going to show you guys of the world that my sister drew based on my scribblings. And eventually, they gather more companions, and that eventually takes them to the town of Dungordor, where they learned how to sword fight and use all of their various weapons in case they got into a duel. Now, this journey of theirs took them a year, or actually it took them 2 years. It took them about a year to get to Dungordor, and then it took them another year to train. So by the time the book was completed, Daniel and Selena were already into their adult years, and there was a reason for that, as explained in the second book. But after they have been in Dungordor for a while, that's when Malsafar launches his attack and burns down the building that they were staying at, which ends up killing Claire in the process. But her last great act was pushing Daniel out of the way so that one of the ceiling beams wouldn't hit him and it hit her instead, and then the building like collapsed on top of her. But then that was also the moment when Chris revealed that he was actually working for Malsafar the whole time and that he was a wizard, and the reason why he went with them in the first place was because he had a ring that actually had Malsafar's eye on it. So like they were connected ocularly. And so he was like essentially Malsafar's spy that was keeping track of where they were so that when Selena came to be 18, Malsafar would know exactly where to find her because he didn't want to strike until she was of age. And again, there's a reason for it. So going forward, he takes them to their castle, makes them prisoners. Seelan tries to bust them out. Then he has this really epic duel with Malsafar, which I wish I could explain it to you guys because my best friend said I'm really good at describing fight scenes. But basically, you got the two creators of the world unleashing everything on each other. But Ceylon loses because Chris comes along at the last minute and like betrays him. So then they're taken to the top of the tower, and it turns out that the reason why Selena's hair was black was because back in the ancient days, which is revealed in the second book, oh gosh, I'm going to have to do some crazy explaining here. So Malsafar in the second book summoned this dark power that gave him even more magic than before. It allowed him to basically like spread his influence and despair throughout all of the world instead of just like within a certain radius of his magic. And in order to make this dark power appear, he had to create a machine to drag the dark power out from the underworld, but then he also needed a way to manifest its appearance because it took the form of a dark sun. So he took a girl with dark hair that had just turned 18, therefore the age of adulthood, and he hooked her up to this machine so that she would be able to essentially like give birth to the dark sun, and that would like come from the essence of her hair. But Chris, in one last state of mercy, because he had grown to get to know this girl, like absorbed her into himself as the process was taking place. And so that like sealed away the dark soul underground again. And so he like used the DNA of this girl to create Selena. But then like the humongous process of absorbing another and creating it into another person caused him to age backwards. And that's how no one knew that he was actually ancient history, because he was able to conveniently age backwards and then grow to be old enough to accompany Daniel and his friends on his quest. And so when it came time to resurrect the dark power that had been sealed away, it literally, like, the remnants of that girl were in Selena's hair. And so after they connected her to the machine and caused her to give birth to the dark power, it caused Selena's hair to turn gray, because that's the only reason why she had dark hair in the first place. And of course, they were able to escape because Ceylon had given Daniel this pouch that gave him one single magical wish because he wasn't a wizard. And so, because the dark power was unleashed, it caused the entire sky to turn red. It caused the sun to be black. The sun was always out. There was never nighttime. There was never a change of seasons. It was always boiling hot. The land was like rugged, and it kind of looked like Mordor in Lord of the Rings, honestly. There were a lot of geysers of fire that would just randomly spout out. Most of the trees were dead, and it was just a very desolate wasteland, and I wanted my characters to feel totally helpless. So, going into the second book, it was revealed that the wizards are actually these genderless beings that when they try to create more of themselves, they're actually unable to do that. Because by design, they weren't designed to procreate or fall in love. So when they tried to use their creation powers to make another wizard, it ended up making a human instead. But in like the ethereal world where they lived before the world was created, humans weren't prepared for that kind of stuff, so they ended up dying. So the reason why the three sages created the world was so that they could create a place that was specifically tailored to human needs, such as having oxygen and food, because the wizards didn't need food, they didn't need to breathe. As long as they were in the presence of the sun, they were able to survive off of that. So they created the world, And that's how they created the humans, which was their attempt at procreation as a way of preserving their race so that if the wizards were all wiped out, then the humans would continue. But then the wizards also didn't understand the concepts of falling in love and having romance, and so they were always like, what the heck? What is it with them specifically wanting people of the opposite sex? Why is it that a person's looks can turn them on? And so I wanted to establish that the wizards and the humans were not like in Harry Potter, where wizards are just humans with magic, that wizards were an entirely different being. They didn't need to breathe or eat or sleep or any of that stuff. Again, as long as they had the sun, they could survive. The wizards also, they didn't start out with skin. That was a byproduct of them transferring onto Earth so that they could fit in with normal society. They could, of course, use magic. And the only way that they would ever, die is if they were killed in battle, which is easier said than done because, with all that magic, they can easily, conjure up protections. So simple human weapons like guns and knives wouldn't be able to do it. So it turned out that Malsafar rebelled against some of the wizards because some of the wizards decided that they were so prejudiced against the humans and against procreation that they decided to form, in my book's universe, the first abortion clinics. So if I was trying to do any agenda in those books, it was a pro-life one, though admittedly from a different point of view. And Malsafar was so disgusted by how they could disregard life so much and kill innocents that he decided that all of those wizards needed to be exterminated. So I guess you could say he became a little bit of a hypocrite by killing people for killing innocents. I guess his mindset was, if you are going to kill innocents, then I will kill you to protect more innocents. So that was my attempt at telling a story for a villain. And I'll, of course, have a picture of him up so that you don't need to use your imagination. And so it turned out that all of the wizards were wiped out except for Chris, Ceylon, and of course Malsafar himself, because the wizards that survived the war were eventually wiped out when Malsafar created the dark power in the first place, which caused all these black flames to just attack the wizards, and it was such an extraordinary power that the wizards couldn't block it. And so Ceylon, in one last-ditch attempt, he sealed away the dark soul, but Malsafar encapsulated that moment in a time capsule so that no one would be able to know what could have killed him in that moment. And I'm doing a pathetic job of explaining it. I'm trying to summarize 3 books long of stuff. And so going into the third book, there's a lot of political and Catholic commentary in that, because eventually Daniel and Selena discover the Shrine of Songs, which is where they learn that there's an even higher power than the wizards, known as Dawn, who's the creator of even the wizards. And he is appearing to give hope to people that feel helpless with, the dark sun and all that. And so it's essentially my way of asking what would happen if, say, God revealed himself in the modern time instead of revealing himself in biblical times, and also a different take on God. I guess now that I mention it, that's another reason why the books weren't published, is because I was talking about how I wanted to have some Catholic theology, but it wasn't going to be a one-to-one perfect representation of the faith, because I wanted it to be good fiction before it was anything else. I didn't want it to be like Narnia, where it was an allegory. So some things were deliberately off to make sure that the book would be good, as opposed to being held back by what the faith taught. And my priest was like, yeah, you could lead people astray by that. And so I didn't want to do that. So that's another reason why it didn't get published. But basically, the reason why I said that Dawn came before the wizards, despite that I just said that the wizards came before time, is I wanted a way to portray the mysteriousness of God in a way that that universe could understand. Because if it was revealed that the wizards created time and they created all the space, that there was a being that came before the before times, as again a way of saying that God is just beyond our comprehension, just as you're probably struggling to comprehend how that works. And he was the one that essentially gave the wizards all of their power, but then he also gave a prophecy that the wizards would meet their downfall if they tried to harm one another with their magic. And so it was revealed that the only way to truly defeat Malsifar would be to essentially summon Dawn as like the ultimate power to defeat him once and for all. So the third book is basically just the characters coming to realize who Dawn is, but also it's a mission to create heaven, essentially. Yeah, I know heaven existed before time, but again, this is my book. I didn't want it to be a perfect retelling of Catholic history. But basically, ever since the start of the third book, Daniel keeps having these dreams of hearing Claire's voice shouting out for help. And so Daniel's primary quest is that he's trying to figure out where Claire is, because like he knows that Claire died in the fire, but he keeps hearing her calling out, asking for to be saved from whatever is going on. And so eventually he does find her. He discovers a passage into the underworld where all of the souls were being kept, because that was one of Malsifar's other goals, was that he didn't want to just kill people or kill the wizards, because he said, well, if you kill someone and they're dead, then that's the end of their suffering. He wanted to create something that would cause eternal suffering. So he managed to create what was called a soul link, so that it would detect whenever a soul was departing the body, and then all those souls would be gathered together into one place, or they would be eternally punished. And so when Daniel arrives in the underworld and sees all of these souls with Claire, Claire's like, oh good, my brother's come, he's going to save all of us. And Daniel's like, you expect me to save all of you? I thought I was just saving my sister. And so he doesn't have the guts to have what it takes to be like the savior of all of the souls. So in desperation, he thinks, well, what if we call upon Dawn? Like maybe his power can save the souls. So then Dawn comes and he says, yes, it is required for the sacrifice to be willing, but you didn't wait for me to come on my own time. Instead, you summoned me in desperation. So that was meant to be like a parallel of Judas's betrayal. So Dawn was like, brutally beaten up and captured by the Dangor, which is like dragon, rearranged. And so Dawn's sacrifice ended up causing the souls to be able to move on to heaven. And so eventually, after a very long and drawn out search for the memory key, which it turned out that Chris had actually given Daniel a birthday present early on in the book, but Daniel didn't know that it was actually the memory key. He thought it was just like a pretty stone, and so he thought nothing of it. And then one day he was just looking through his backpack and he's like, oh, silly me, I had it all along. And it turned out that Chris actually hadn't truly betrayed him. What happened was, during the war, Ceylon had ordered Chris to go and stop Malsifar from raising the dark power. And in doing so, Chris lost the battle. And so he, with his sword, he managed to strike Malsifar in the eye, but then in retaliation, Malsifar pinned Chris to the ground and used his magic to take that part of his eye and inscribe it into Chris's finger. And he's like, now that my eye is connected to your finger, I can control you. So whenever I have a surge of anger, it goes into you. So now you are my servant. And the only reason why Chris was able to tell Daniel that he wasn't against him and to say check your backpack, that's where you'll find the weakness key, was because Daniel had fought Chris in a duel at one point in the book, and he ended up cutting off Chris's hand, which in turn broke the curse of I think I called it the ocular link, which was way before the Oculus Rift came out, by the way. But it turns out that during the final battle, Daniel was killed by Malsifar, but Malsifar, of course, being him, he didn't want Daniel to just have an instant death, especially now that he knew that the souls had been liberated. So he purposely created a surge of magic so that after he fatally stabbed Daniel, he wouldn't die right away, that he'd still spend some time writhing in agony. But thankfully, Selena was in the battle with Daniel, and she sang the incantation that summoned Dawn to the battlefield. But of course, in typical Christ-like fashion, Dawn didn't come to condemn. He came to ask Malsifar if he wanted a second chance. He said, I know that you've done so much evil, but you can change your ways. I can give you more perspective. I can help you truly feel fulfilled. And so in the end, Malsifar repented. He even apologized to Daniel for killing him. Of course, Daniel wasn't dead at that time. And he was so willing to change that Dawn even like changed his appearance, that he wasn't all burned and charred anymore, that he was like back to how he was in his original form. And the reason why Malsifar got like his burned and charred appearance was that he entered into a forbidden garden that Dawn had told the wizards to never set foot in, because that garden was like the source of food for the wizards. That's another side story. I think I'll save that for another time if I do at all. But basically, he had said, don't eat from this garden. Malsifar did, and it ended up like creating a visible manifestation of his soul. So, yeah, Daniel dies, but then the book doesn't end with Daniel's death. It goes on to explain what the survivors did to like recreate the world now that the dark soul was perished. But then Daniel went through like this purgatorial journey where he like went through, this is after his death, he like went through the forest, found a cabin in the woods, and that's where he met his father, and his father revealed his backstory. And then so they like had a reconciliation with each other, and that reconciliation was enough for Daniel to be able to move on, because he had never truly made amends with his father. So then Daniel had to swim through a pool of fire. And just as the fire was about to burn off all of his skin, Dawn reached in and pulled Daniel out into this like spring of water. And that caused Daniel's body to be reborn in the water. And so therefore Daniel was able to go to heaven and see all of his dead siblings again. And then they said, hey, Daniel, want to go on another adventure? Because if you think this is good, wait till you see more of it. So that was again my way of explaining that heaven was like so far beyond our comprehension that even the stuff that I described was like paradise for Daniel, that there was still even more than what I described, which is kind of like how we have our imagination of what heaven is, but we still can't fully comprehend everything that God has planned until we actually get there. So I think that's all of relevance. I think I'm just going to keep this to the Dawn trilogy for now, because this went on way longer than I thought, and explain about the other books in another video. So for right now, I want to show you guys some pictures of some of the characters and the map and all of that. So I will edit them over this. So the first thing I have to show you is the cover art of what was going to be the book, or at least a rough cover. I don't remember how I got the cover, if it was drawn or if it was like a public domain thing, but basically it looks exactly like how I pictured the dark sky to be. Now, admittedly, I wanted the sun to be black, but the horizon happened to be black enough that I felt like it captured that essence. Next, we have the map of my world. So on the right, you can see the island of Danport, which is Daniel's home island, and as evidenced by the line that my sister drew, it was separated from the rest of the wizard world. So then after they crossed the sea, they had to go through Far Nor Woods into Far Nor Field, and then there were like a lot of mountainous and hilly terrain, and then that led them like through a whole bunch of different locations, and I'm not going to bore you with each of them, but then Dungordor is this giant fortress of military might, which is where they learned how to combat Malsifar. Then we have a couple of pictures of Selena here. This next one is a picture of a girl that I found on one of my DVD player softwares on my old computer. And I just thought, like, wow, she's like the closest I've found to meeting a real girl that looks like Selena. I do have a picture of another girl from one of my conferences, but I didn't want to show that. I don't know why. I'll probably explain later. I also have a me that I created of Selena, so that's her right there with the long dark hair. Then we also have Claire in two forms. First, we have Claire as a me. So here she is right here. I deliberately made her eyebrows go down like that because I wanted to portray her pantophobia, but the half smile being like the optimistic side of her. And then I had my friend Kayla draw this interpretation of Claire. So that's like portraying more of the innocent side of her. I wanted her to be blue, not only because that's my favorite color, but also because it like symbolizes tranquility and peacefulness. And yes, Claire is spelled with an E. Now, some of you might be wondering why I chose the name Claire. It was actually because I met a girl on my soccer team and I liked the name Claire and I thought her appearance was very unique, but I didn't want to just copy and paste this girl's personality. So I ended up using her name, Claire, and her like appearance, but like creating an entirely new character out of the Claire in my book, which my sister claimed was meant to be her, but that honestly wasn't what I was thinking at all when I created it. And here's Mulsifar. And again, the dark skin is meant to represent how his flesh was burned away to show like the inner workings of his soul. I'm surprised I couldn't find too many more pictures. A lot of them were very primitive drawings, so I don't think you'd like the rest of them. Generally speaking, the one last thing I'd like to say about my novel trilogy is that I wanted it to be all like each book have a different theme. The first book was all about like adventure and discovery. The second book was more of like a history slash origin story where like every single thing you could think of was explained. Why is it that the wizards were genderless? Why did they create the world? Why were they even called the sages in the first place? It turns out that sage is an abbreviation for start of the ages. See, I didn't want to just be cliche. I wanted everything to have an explanation. And then Dawn of the Forsaken Souls was like a political commentary on what it would be like to discover God in the modern era. And another thing I wanted to do was I wanted to like shove in as many references to my past as possible in the book. So there were a lot of inside jokes and sayings that would only make sense to people that know me. So like the characters would sometimes make these random quips. Like at one point Claire just says, you know, Dan, well, some context, they were being attacked by these water monsters. And Claire, of course, being the scaredy cat that she is like paralyzed with fear the whole time. So after they defeat the water monsters, Claire says, Daniel, for the rest of the quest, I think I'm just going to drink lemonade. And that was meant to be a callback to the fact that when we had parish meals together, they would often have lemonade as a secondary drink. Or when Chris shakes one of the sofas in a hotel lobby and finds quarters dumping out of it, that was a callback to how my mom's best friend's husband would often let us search his house to find money. And at one point he even said, like, shake the sofa, you'll find plenty of loose change in there. And so, like, a whole bunch of little things like that added up to just be like a giant allegory of my past. As most of you would know, I still like to reminisce about the past quite a lot. So this has gone on for a stupidly long amount of time, but I thank all of you for being willing to sit through my reminiscing. I'd like to thank my patrons, Matthew Rakowski, Sploon Ghost, and Splatcat, for giving me a lot of financial support and also like giving me the incentive to keep the Patreon. If you would like to join, the link is in the description. So I hope you all have a wonderful day. Please comment below if you like my ideas and if you lament the fact that they're not published, and try to keep it friendly to the LGBT community though. Like, I don't want to bash them because they're going through so much suffering and so many people saying that they're freaks that I don't want to do that. I think even if you disagree with their mindset, I mean, I do, but you can be respectfully disagreeing. So keep it nice, keep it civil, or just don't mention them at all. Just keep it to yourselves. And until the next time, remember to keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye.